Hello, my name is Dr. Jackalyn Rainosek. I'm with DTP-Leadership Group, and this is Hot Topic Bold Talk. And I am very happy to have my colleague with me, Nigel Lakey, because we have started talking about ways that we hope we can tell people or share with people what we're trying to do in order to be able to talk to people and come to some resolution, about letting go of the idea of politics and being able to talk about discussions where we can do something constructive. And so that's what we're doing. So, Nigel, I'm very happy to have you here. And so let me start, and then you just go wherever you think to. I'd like to talk first about the people I have real difficulty with, and and I want us to be sure and talk about how we may have difficulty with them, but what did we learn to be able to work with somebody like this? So I'm just going to start with one time, and I'm sure you got some that you can name, and we can talk about them. I think one that really gets me sometimes is the person who acts like they're quoting some kind of information, but when I listen to them, it has no substance to it, and it sounds more like labeling things and not naming where they're getting this information from. And so I know what happens to me is I'll sit there for a moment and become very confused, and at some point I might say to myself, do you really know what you think you know about the political scene and all the things that are going on right now? And then I suddenly realized something. They have never read anything, and they only listen to things that are of a one particular type of source. They've never been open to it. And then if I say anything to them, I know that they're going to start getting uncomfortable because they don't have the real knowledge base to talk about whatever conversation they're talking about. Now that one drives me crazy. And I don't allow them to drive me crazy anymore. But I think I started in on a conversation with an individual who said he wanted to talk to me because he thought I had different points of view. So I said, okay. And we started talking about abortion. And um, we started pretty well, and then he started quoting a bunch of things that he had, and I just knew it had to be from religious groups that I'm very familiar with. And I finally, the one thing that helped us move in a different direction was I said, what are the resources that you've used to provide this information to me? And Nigel, he started telling me, and I knew exactly which Christian website it came out of.
Mhm.
And I said, could we lay that aside? Can you and I just talk as human beings about what really are our concerns about abortion? What are the things we would like to see? And I said, I will be happy to give you any data that I have and give you the resources you can read them. Interestingly enough, after we finally let go of all that, he even, he started saying, well, you say it should be 18 weeks, and I say it should be 14 weeks that they determine what's happening with the person that's pregnant. Anyway, we went into a discussion that sounded reasonable. You know, I don't know if we resolved anything, but at least we know each other a little better. And I don't know, but I'm sure you have stories like this and we can keep talking about it. So go for it. That's my first one, Nigel.
Yeah, look, I understand that one. And I think we last time we talked about self-awareness, and I'm going to key on that a little bit.
Sure.
And, and we talked about the outrage associated with headline news and that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So I think both of those issues you brought together. So forgive me a second here as I kind of weave this around, right? So in my own experience, personally and professionally, I've been of an orthodox opinion on things, and that orthodoxy is not religion, right? That just means that it's a hard belief. And it can be any number of things, right? It can be an engineering principle. And we've seen industrial catastrophes as a consequence of somebody being so hardline to a doctrine of a belief on something.
Right.
Look, I think that easily moves into our social environment, the people that we know, the business environment we live in, and goodness, the political environment too. So like, I've had cases where I've thought that I'm right, and that can be from a lack of information. It can be from the fact that that's the only information that I've got. But there's also been cases where, frankly, I believe that I'm in the right and probably have had doubts in my own mind, right? So that's the case. You argue a point. You don't really have a lot of ground that you can stand on. It's just what you believe. Now, I'm going to throw this back a little bit to an educational system. We've long since abandoned this concept of a classical education and teaching people about critical thinking skills. If you
Amen.
have this debate about something that's in the headlines, I don't think that that's a bad thing because headlines, they tell you what's topical, they tell you what people are talking about, and frankly, they tell you probably what's going to be on a political calendar. But the reality then, if you pull back some, is you have to understand where those viewpoints originated. How do you come to believe that? And to your point, right, what's your knowledge source? What information are you looking at? And
Right on.
I think that if you stick to a set of values that are born of religion, then you're absolutely hardwired, indoctrinated. And look, I've got a lot of good friends who are quite religious. Goodness sakes alive, right? We live in the South, we live in Texas. Probably 70% of the people that you meet go to one church or another, right? That's pretty much the United Church or the Catholic Church. So you know that to a large extent, they're going to have a set of hardline opinions. So if that's your basis, it's hard to have a conversation with somebody like that. But while I do know a lot of people, and I've got a very good friend who's an intellectual property lawyer. I've worked with him for a number of years, and he's deeply Christian. But we're having conversations on what you could say is reality, and by that I mean quantum mechanics reality, right? Physics. And his mind is pretty open. So he's got a set of facts and a set of values that are born from a religious upbringing, but his mind is open enough to entertain my random thoughts about the existence of time and these sorts of things. Now, where am I going with that, right? So I asked your permission to ramble a little bit, but let me bring that back. When you have conversations with people like that, what do you do? That I think the worst thing is to respond with your own sort of outrage and tell them
Right.
that they have no idea what they're talking about. And the best thing to do is try and find out, as you've suggested, where do you get that information? Now, can you have that discussion in a non-combative way? But that's the self-awareness part that I believe we've spoken about. And to me, that's the greater part of how do you have a conversation with somebody who doesn't believe the same stuff that you do?
Right.
Can't, is it to find a common ground? I don't know. Sometimes it works. But the worst thing is to respond with outrage. And we see this all over the place, right? Where the,
Right.
the theatrics begin and the theatrics get elevated. And if we stand back a little, the situation can tend to diffuse itself. But I would say, that only comes from one, age, in my own opinion, right? As I sit here at my age, and experience. If you hadn't had to deal with those situations, and many people haven't, right? They live a somewhat insulated life and they're just not particularly self-aware. So I think it's all right. I think it's a good thing to say in a manner that's acceptable. How do you get to that point? How do you know that? Have you looked at the underlying issues? And frankly, you can probably walk away and say, we agree to disagree, but this is not the sort of thing that's going to make us enemies. And it should never turn into that.
Well, I think one of the things that I would say about it is that I think that I can get to a place to say, It seems you have a very strong position on this particular topic. I think it's always helpful since we don't know each other as well. I think it's really helpful for you to tell me what kind of resources you use to establish this kind of thought pattern or these ideas. Because to be real honest, the number of people I run into that are very rigid, opinionated, and so forth, they do it to try to back somebody off so they don't have to have the background, the experience, and the knowledge to be able to have the discussion. So what I would say to you is, I think also I've run into something that is fascinating to me. People literally, there are two things they do with me. They either are shocked that I have such a different point of view, yet they've maybe been in meetings with me for years, or something, than them. And I've had some that are so insecure about their position that I finally had a man say to me, I'm really disappointed that you don't support my point of view. And I just said, I cannot support your point of view. This is my life experience. This is what my values are. This is what my beliefs are. These are things that I stand by, and I'm very willing to have a discussion with you, but I'm not going to sit here and argue with you or try to go point by point. So, what are you willing to do? And oftentimes, Nigel, they back off.
So, but we're in this place and time, right, where look, I don't know what it is. I think it's partially the outrage that comes from the press. It's partially a lack of critical thinking, and those are really personal opinions. Okay, I'm not trying to offend anybody with those statements, but if the
I
first thing,
support those ideas. I
well, but
support
if the
those
first thing that you
ideas.
do is tell somebody that without even understanding their background, their basics, the first thing that you want to do is label them and condemn them. I don't know how you overcome that. And you and I talked on the last podcast. It's cost me a couple of friendships, and several of which I don't think there's any prospect of repair because these people, they just live in this world, and I don't think that they can see anything else. Now, some of that comes of age, some of that comes of upbringing. I don't know. I'm not trying to get into the psychology or the psychiatry part of it, but if you can't sit down with somebody to have a leveling conversation, then you've got a problem, right? The dynamics of that group or that duo, that's seriously an issue. But to your point, right? I see people who the first thing they want to do is convince you. And again, all due respect, but the evangelicals that knock on my door, not so much where I am now in a gated community,
Oh, no, I
but
know. I know.
but in other worlds and other times, it's they knock on the door and they tell me that their belief system is better than mine, and I'm condemned as a consequence of not following their belief. Now, I think I'm reasonably educated, classical education, I may say also. And I think that I've made some valued judgments and some analysis to resolve that I'm fairly comfortable with where I am. And look, label me, I'm the Republican in this conversation, but I'm also principally the conservative, right? And there's a distinction. Now, not to get into politics, that's not the intent. But if somebody, the first thing they want to do is say, why don't you believe what I believe? I just think that they lack that self-awareness and they're not paying attention. They haven't bothered to understand anything, your opinion, their opinion, the press, etc. And this is a thing that when we started, we talked about the Great Divide. And damn it, this just continues, right? The polarization is killing us as a society, is killing us as a country. It puts this republic at risk. How do we stop that? How do we stop the inflammatory rhetoric? And I don't know, okay? But I think one of the first things you do is sit down with somebody, you just have this conversation, and you try to appreciate where they are and how they are. And look, none of us walks away saying, well, I've convinced the other person that I'm right and I've won this battle, because that's not the intent.
No.
I think what we're trying to do is have a leveled conversation. And I'm just frustrated as hell with the politics that we see, because that continues to feed the the rhetoric continues to feed the divide and just supports the polarization. I think in the last podcast we talked about, we only had 2 or 3 news networks. And really, you had the national news network and then you had the private news network. And I'm talking about growing up in Canada. And when you had broadcast news, it was pretty much the same. Now we've got these 50, 60, 100 news channels that are on cable, streaming, or whatever. And, they're looking for subscribers and they want that polarized view. So I'm
Well,
frustrated
and,
with that.
well, and I can understand your frustration. I think one of the things that I do know, though, is I think if I sit down with you and I say, let's lay aside politics or lay aside these news burning issues that are out there, let's get to know each other. How do we know each other? And you and I started that way because I said, tell me your story. And you told me an immigrant. You told me all the travels you've done, the many countries you've lived in. And then we started talking, and I said, let's talk about the values we have. Well, the truth of it is, one of my values is honesty. You may have a different word for it, but we could talk because we knew that. And the other thing I think is really important is to say, I don't want to argue anymore about these issues. I want to have a discussion with you, find out what are you reading? What are you listening to? What do you think is helping you to make some kind of decision about what's going on? Because I really believe 70% of the people in America want the same thing you and I are talking about right now.
Yeah.
I don't, it's a small group that's gotten control of this country. And I think you and I are saying, wait a minute, there's other ways to do it. And I know what I do with you. I want to know what your opinions are. There, I'm not frightened by your opinions.
Mhm.
I want to know your opinion so we can have a discussion about something. And
This,
I want to, one other comment and then I'll stop. One of the other things I know is I want to sit back and relax and say, all we're going to have is a discussion about X or Y or whatever.
yeah.
And we'll get into it at some point because you and I have agreed we're going to get into topics and whatever. But I think I just sit back and I say, if he says something that I don't feel as comfortable with, because see, I've stopped using the word agree and disagree because I think it creates conflict, it creates polarized positions. So I say, can I support this? Can I really, can I, or do I have other views? Do I have other options of the way I look at it? And that's what I think people have forgotten. They've forgotten there are all kinds of options for us to come together and
Mhm.
resolve some of this stuff. So I'll stop now. It's your turn.
So let me say this as kind of the conclusion, but then I'll back up with some of the supporting aspects, right? I'd say you and I could consider ourselves to be informed voters. Now, just back away from the political aspect of that. But when you say a large portion of the population wants the same thing, I really absolutely agree with that, right? Now, I don't know exactly what those things are. I think on balance, you could say, well, we like national security. And we're going to have a little debate on what does that mean exactly. Right? We
Right.
want a stable economy. Well, what does that mean? We want a robust immigration system. Well, what does that mean? And now it's appropriate to be a little more self-aware and say, well, on that particular topic, what does that mean to me?
Right.
And if we stay out of the headlines, I think that probably we would align, I'm going to say, on 70 or 80 percentile of what
Right.
that means to us. Now, that might be you and I somewhat unique, and I have other people that I speak to. I think I could say the same thing of them, but we are controlled by these fringes on either side. And God forbid that we have a third party. I cannot imagine what that turns us into. We look like Britain or Germany or whatever. But
Right.
all right, so we've got the fringes here and the fringes there, and they like the headlines, they like the rhetoric, they like the outrage. But in the meantime, there's a large part of the population that's just trying to have a conversation to be better informed, to better understand and say, is this a set of values that I believe? Is this an individual who's standing up and can I trust that person? Is their background, do they have the same beliefs? Do they believe in integrity and honesty? And are they even believable? Or are they just fanning the flames? And I
Right.
think this is one of our principal risks. We have the people who like the outrage because they're watching cable news and don't read a damn newspaper any longer. So they get drawn to the fire. And
Right.
I don't know how to stop that. All right. And maybe you and I having a conversation is one step towards getting a million other people or 10 million or whatever it is, just to have a conversation and say, really, does this align with my values? Or am I just saying that I dislike or I want to hate the other person so much that I'm going to go over there?
Well, and
That's the
I,
thing that we have to try and stop. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that's what you and I are trying to do. And I don't care, it's not important for me, particularly that people see how collegial we are with each other, because maybe they can learn from that. Um, and I do think there's some common ground we have. So that's the reason we can go into some subjects and topics and consider some things. So we're going to talk about various topics because I think that's it. I think what we're doing right now, though, is to say if you have someone that will not agree to some simple things, like we'll speak one at a time. If we'd like to say something, we can say, hey, I'd love to interrupt you because I'd like to make a point with that. And it's an acceptable process. Or, look, have you ever thought about this option, about what we could do? But I think it has to be one of, and I really emphasize that, drop the debate and the screaming at each other and getting all emotional about it. And let's have a conversation and dialogue with each other so we can decide what can be done next, what can happen. Because there are too many things going on right now. To me, as a woman, I don't care if I'm past the age of having children. I worry about my young friends who live in Texas and have such rigid abortion laws because I am concerned about them and their health. I have one right now that has a lot of health issues. I think you and I can talk about that.
You
And
know,
I don't know what your view will be, you know,
well, you,
talk about it.
you probably will know what my view will be, right? And neither of us, frankly, is trying to change how the other is eventually going to vote. But
That's right.
the
That's right.
this is not about Jackalyn and Nigel. It is about saying that here's a couple of people who can have a conversation, right? And I suggest we'll, in time, get into some testy issues, but none of those, I believe, are going to get the outrage and the rhetoric that, this news channel or that news channel tends to show. So if a handful of people watch us and say, I'm going to hold my breath, it might be difficult to do it, but I'm going to listen instead of just waiting for an opportunity to speak. And it's less about trying to prove that I'm wrong or they're wrong, but it is about trying to say, hmm, does this conversation again, does it light up some values? If it's so offensive, and look, you and I are probably having these conversations, not amongst us, I don't believe, but I've had them with people, and I'm sure you have, where you just walk away.
Amen.
One, because it's not worth your own energy. And look, to me, it's not worth my mental health to try and deal with idiots. And that's a luxury that's afforded me because I'm old. And I can withstand being seen as a crotchety old person who just bitches and whines, right? But there are other people, and it's less about trying to convert them. And it's more about trying to say, well, I've got a friendship, I've got a relationship, can I preserve that? And honestly, that's one thing I'm trying to do. It's less about trying to find a whole bunch of people that believe in the same stuff as I do than it is to find some people that it's worthwhile having a conversation with. Because God knows there's way more to talk about than this party or that party. We've got bigger issues that are not politicized. Somebody can make them politicized, right?
Right.
But you and I have talked about our desire to preserve this thing called the Constitution. Now,
Amen.
I'm kind of an originalist, and my opinion is you read the Federalist Papers, and that tells you what the founders were thinking. And I use that fairly much as the background that says, why is this part of the Constitution like that? Right? What are the founders, what were they thinking now? I mean, there's an interpretation. I have an interpretation. Others may have, but it's a pretty damn good thing, right? We're unique around the world. Just happened July 4th. We've got a Constitution that still works. Now, what do we do with that thing? Okay, how do we make this society, this country better by using the Constitution instead of trying to find ways to dismantle it, to completely reinterpret it? And there's a lot of aspects in there, that I think are worth a conversation at some time. Electoral college, et cetera, et cetera. Do we have a democracy versus a
Right.
constitutional republic? And those are nuanced conversations, but I think it's appropriate to say, well, what does that mean to us, right? And again, what we're trying to not do is have a fiery debate. We're trying to say this is how you have a conversation around these things. And there are topical issues. And yeah, maybe they're going to be uncomfortable. And I don't really know how to address those. It's less, once again, about having the confrontation than it is about saying, well, here's an issue that people think is important, and they're going to vote around it. So how do we help them better understand what it is? And what one thing that frustrates me is always the headlines about, well, we're eroding rights, we're eroding rights, eroding rights. I, and I'm trying not to make that political statement, but think about what this means. It's a preservation of Constitution, it's a preservation of the idea of the founding fathers, this sort of thing. We shouldn't reduce our conversations to, well, we're eroding rights. We say, well, is there a security issue here? Is there what's behind this? And again, this goes to the original conversation in podcast one of awareness and I'm going to say making a conscious choice to educate yourself on issues.
Well, and I think what I would say is I have ended relationships with individuals that started. I thought we were going along really well. We seemed to have some amazing conversations. It looked like things were reasonable. And then all of a sudden, let's say that I don't talk to that person for a month and I get back on them and they start this accusatory, I've thought about this, da, 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 and I just, I'm not willing to deal with that anymore, Nigel. And I think you say you're Republican, but I happen to know you're a Reagan Republican more than whatever.
Sure.
So and what I find is many of my friends are Reagan Republicans, and I talk with them. But there are some that I've been able to talk with that are more current day with the Republican Party, but there's a judge that I'm going to set up an appointment with because he's running for a judge position with the Republican Party. And we started talking, and what was interesting about it is I said, well, let's go back to values and let's go back to see what we do. And let's see what we can find in common. And he and I started laughing because immediately our two issues were we want to protect children and what happens to them in this world, and we want to protect animals. Well, now, if two of us can agree we want to protect stuff, then it's much easier to talk about the Constitution and some of our differences of opinion, but it's much better. I'm going to tell you now that I read Epic Times because you encouraged me to do that. Now, I tried to get you to read The Atlantic, so I don't know if you ever went, but there are some good things coming out. Don't
I
laugh.
touch on the Atlantic and Harper's and the Economist from time to time.
Okay, yeah.
But
And I have to do something like that. But in order to maintain, besides that, I think it's boring to sit with people that have no other different
Mhm.
points of view from me. And what I feel sad about is I have friends calling me and are just irate about things. And yeah, they have similar points of view to mine, but they're irate, they're really upset and whatever. And I've said, you need to start listening to Nigel and I, and you need to have friends that you can talk with, that you can see where you're getting some ideas that maybe you could get some other people involved with, and maybe we could start shifting some of this stuff.
so, you hit on something. You said you're going to talk to this conservative slash Republican judge, right? And this is an interesting thing for me, and I'd be I'd be keen to understand how your conversation goes
Mhm.
because we can talk about the values. And look, I'm going to say this, politics should come down to values and serving the community, the nation, etc., in escalation, right? Your local community, your town, your state,
Amen.
excuse me, your what the hell the words, your county, your state,
Yeah,
country, right? And you can think about what decisions that I make or what I do, my actions, how do they manifest themselves up to that level, okay? And that's,
right,
I'm going to say, kind of a federalist viewpoint. But we agree there's a lot of things that are important to us. And we agree that these are important to us because, damn it, they improve our overall quality of life, right? They go towards the belief of this great social experiment that's the United States of liberty and freedom and happiness, this kind of thing. And we
right,
want to protect life in general. So we want children to not feel threatened. We want them to get out of dangerous situations. And look,
right.
people will condemn me because I love animals too. I got 3 cats. I collect orange cats, okay? And I want to see them happy. And yes, damn it, I feed the raccoons and I fed the possums. And the bobcat that's in my backyard, well, he gets a few doves. I'll get off of that soapbox, right? But what we've done is suggest that there's some common ground. Now, the beliefs that we have, let's talk about those, right? Let's talk about how this elected individual is going to protect our beliefs, this sort of thing. But instead, we allow this rhetoric, the outrage to engulf us. I don't know how to stop that, but if we can have conversations around what's our belief, and then you can have a debate around some of the thornier issues. But again, none of this, it shouldn't be that we're going to condemn this person or that person or laud this person or that person. I mean, damn it, our political system has just become, it's unhinged. And
Well,
as a
and
Reagan
yeah,
conservative, I would say I just don't have the time for that outrage, right? Because you're not understanding they're not understanding, they're not paying any attention, they haven't looked at any of the underlying issues. And it seems like we just continue to elect people. That's what they do for a living. So how do we, I don't know, reform? First thing I say, term limits in the Senate, damn it, term limits everywhere. Stop
amen.
people from getting, it's a career to be reelected and making empty promises they don't have to live with. Ah,
Well, and I think these are the points that we need to go into and talk with and show people that we can do that. I do want to mention this. I think any time that you and I start a conversation, we have some very basic things that are the grounding force for both of us. You and I have spent our professional careers being of service to other human beings. I know many of your stories that through multiplicity of organizations, that as a vice president or whatever position you were in, that you literally helped develop the people that were in your particular group or whatever it was, and you supported them by going to coaching and everything else. I spend my time talking with business owners who have problems and they can't allow their company to move forward and be as successful as they can be because they have behavior patterns that are totally unacceptable and they have no idea what those are. I know what those are. I can give them 24 blocking techniques and say, which ones are you using? Because that's what's destroying your communication. And it's affecting, your organization. But I think we have to start with, I don't know how to support the Constitution of the United States and democracy if I am not willing to be of service to other people. And my belief is, I'm reading a book now, and I'll probably mention it next time, and I will send you the author so you can get it yourself, because I think it's excellent. It is written by one of the women that is on strict scrutiny, and they're lawyers, and they talk a lot about the Supreme Court decisions and all kinds of things. But she has done a wonderful thing. Melissa has taken, and I will be sure and give the reference but after I give you the information too. But one of the things I like about it, she has literally taken history and court cases and everything and has put the entire Constitution in a book and then talks about the aspects of the Constitution. And she's put the whole Constitution in this book and then talks about it, provides information and so forth. And, you know, I think what I'm saying is we have to start educating ourselves. We need civic programs again, or discussions like this that are civic programs where we look at and say, okay, this is what the Constitution says. Now, where do you see this happening? Where do you not see this happening? What do we need to do to get people to support this idea? Because in her book, last night, I quickly read the preamble to the Constitution. And I want to go, I don't think anybody's read it for years. And they don't know what it says about the excitement we could have. And it's not exciting to live in the world right now. It's not, because it's.
Let's, can we build on that for a second?
Sure.
Because that's one of the best descriptions I've heard, that it's not exciting. We're, as a society, as individuals, as humans, we're by and large, we live in a state of fear because we have no idea who's crazier than whomever else. And diplomacy, the world stage has all of the fiery rhetoric and the outrage that we've got in our local civil politics, right?
Right.
And, we may choose to paint this side with corruption or that side with racism or whatever. But we have to be very cautious with those labels because, frankly, they stick on everything and everybody.
Right.
It depends on our perspective, right? So if we step back a little, try and cast a critical glance, use some of our experience and our education and understand, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of this is just pandering. And that's the thing, I'm going to put that out and then put it aside. That just pisses me off, all the pandering, right? The special interests and the identity politics. So we live in this world where we're scared of, I don't know, being good. It's like we're ashamed of being American and have the American exceptionalism and the excellence that we enjoy in the lifestyle, et cetera. And we shouldn't be. That's not to defend a political party one way or the other. But we're in this great place where, we can have this conversation, we can have this debate, we can exchange emails with no risk of being arrested because of it. As a UK citizen, I carry that passport. I can't do that in the UK if I live there. As a Canadian citizen, and I carry that passport, I could not do that in Canada because every one of these things could be conjured as hate speech, right? And I can do that in the United States because the First Amendment, which needs more protection than it's getting, allows us to have reasonable
Amen.
discourse, okay? So you can talk about the right to assemble and peaceful protest and that kind of thing. It doesn't give anybody the right to burn anything down, but we have this protected right that we can have discourse. And my goodness, that is unique, right? And it's the First Amendment to the Constitution that talks about happiness, etc. So, what do we do to protect that? Because we live in this world where, some of us is convinced that that First Amendment's at risk. And I don't care, once again, what party, this party, that party, any one of them can put their thumb on that. And there's a history, Second Amendment, Third Amendment, whatever, any amendment, they will try and tip the balance. And they is the broad they, not any
Right.
individual or party. But we've got a system that to a degree compensates for that. And once again, it lets us have a conversation around it, and we can express our displeasure not only verbally in email, but also at the voting booth, right? So, how do we protect this? And once again, we're kind of back to these are the shared values that we have. We want to protect this thing because, frankly, it's unique around the world, but to live in fear that one side or the other side is going to somehow crush this down, can we stop that? I mean, can we? Look, I mean, that's a rhetorical question, but how can you stop that? How can you stop the inflammatory rhetoric, the people there and here from saying these things and telling us that we're all at risk? Well, damn it, there's enough fear on the world stage with crazy people. We don't need that sown here. Right? We don't need it sown and watered here. Then I'll get off my
Well,
soapbox.
no, I don't think it's a soapbox because I think uh, this is the way I look at it. I may be able, and I have been in my lifetime, I've been in business 48 years as a therapist and then a coach and an organizational development consultant. And I have tried to touch people's lives continually and build healthy, respectful, enjoyable work environments because I don't think there are a lot of them that are around. I don't, most of the time I walk in organizations, Nigel, they have behavior patterns and suppression of conversations and
Yeah.
things like that because they don't know how to communicate, not be, have a fight about it or something. So I think it's sad. And so my purpose in life has been to set up whatever I can to educate and to be able to have conversations. Now, you know that I do not support the current administration. It's not something I can support because I do not think it establishes what were the three branches of our country and what was established in the Federalist Papers. So I am a big supporter of a three branch system.
Mhm.
I'm a big supporter of people paying attention to their constituents and realizing what their constituents want and go in and when they say they're going to do something, do it. Don't back away from it and get scared of it. Now, some of my friends have told me that I am a really nervy woman because I have been addressing the Supreme Court decisions with one of my good friends who's also a Reagan Republican. And, I've chosen people that are more conservative than me to work with. And he and I are looking at all the decisions and we are giving statements and we educate ourselves. I spend hours reading these court cases he gives me, and I'm not a lawyer. He's the lawyer, so he gets to explain it all. I think what I've done though is I'm saying I want to have you for us talking about how we can talk about things in this country and go into some of the discussions and have whatever opinions we have put forth. I want Richard, because he's a brilliant lawyer, he can help interpret some of these things that are disturbing to me. And I don't think most Americans are even paying any attention to what's happening in the court system. I have another individual I'm talking to that I shall see because it may add something else. But I also know for myself that I've gotten away from the rhetoric in politics, and I'm trying to take the things that I do read and then put them into thought patterns about how we can utilize them somehow. Last week was a change, and there's been a change that's been going on for months now. But last week I did some things in my podcast that I thought really represented what I want. I want people educated. I want people to understand the importance of our country. And I think it's one of the better ones that I did. You know, it's and I did share it with you. I think I emailed it to
Yep.
you. So I
So look, I think there's a couple of points there, right?
yeah.
We can talk about this administration or that administration, and I think these are without putting names, but it is more about saying, well, what's the doctrine that we're trying to express, right? And I would say, the Supreme Court, in my opinion, has taken a stance that is more fundamental and less interpretive, and I'm comfortable with that, right? And people would say, well, the Supreme Court has acted irresponsibly. The Supreme Court is overly this way or that way. Well, the Supreme Court waxes and wanes, of course, with the wind. And next decade Supreme Court will not be the same as the Supreme Court. But I think there's something that's really important here, which is that in my memory and my research, the Supreme Court has not done anything that fundamentally jeopardizes the Republic of the United States of America. And I think that's extremely important, right? The Supreme Court's task is to take a legal situation, interpret it, and see if it fits with the constitutional framework. And you could say, well, these are momentous, they're horrible decisions, etc. Well, for potentially a slice of the population, yes, they're significant. But that pendulum has swung both ways for years and years and years, and it will continue to do so. I look at it and say, well, as the court made decisions that are born of the intent of federalism, and I mean, I'm not a lawyer either. Okay, I'm 46 years in this game. I've had enough legal interactions that I think that that's not a profession that I would enjoy. Now, the Supreme Court is well above that, of course. Okay, but they take lower court interpretations and they resolve them, and that's a good thing. And we can say we don't like their opinion, we don't like their judgment, we don't like the majority opinion, et cetera, et cetera. But again, I'm going to look at this and I would say, and again, it's my opinion, right? That they've done nothing that jeopardizes this thing that we call a republic. It's not going to derail the social experiment. The Constitution's intact, and none of these things, in my opinion, anyways, has been this, quote, constitutional crisis. These are they're narrow opinions on relatively narrow topics. An opinion once again. But I think the issue is, in my opinion, at a lower level, what are we doing? Are we politicizing every damn thing that comes in front of us? And that's a risk that we've got. And that's been ongoing also at the lower court level. And to me, this is once again a place that, well, term limits on everybody. Okay, any elected official, judge, whatever, Supreme Court, they can't be appointed for life. There's got to be a reasonable term. And the problem is, of course, you get into a role and you've got a job, you've got a career for life, you've got no risk. And there's got to be some risk associated with it. There's got to be something that either recalls or you're not going to get reelected. So I'm going to get back to your comment on civics, right? We don't talk about that any longer. We like revisionist history. Everybody likes to cut out bits and pieces that they feel uncomfortable with. We don't talk about global history any longer. So we have an education system that's just it's broken. I have no idea if that can even be fixed. I mean, I suspect it can, but this is a generational issue, not something that happens with one administration. But there's got to be some continuity. And I think this is one of the big failures we have. Every administration, I don't care whether it's at your city level, your state level, everyone shows up and they derail everything that the previous administration did because that's how they got voted in, right? It's we blame everything on the previous administration. We're going to make it better and
Right.
different. And all we end up doing as a society is paying more for less and getting more and more fractures and more divisiveness. So you and I hope, are starting this concept of having a conversation around how do you stop that fringe element and get back to reasonable discourse, where what we're voting on, what we're talking about truly are pivotal issues. And they're going to improve society. And you made a comment, and I'll stop after this, but my task as an executive, as a business owner, whatever, has been to get a whole bunch of people to succeed. And I
Right.
have worked in organizations where I've seen very poor managers who are insensitive, who are functionally ignorant, don't talk to their people. I can't work in those environments. And that's one of the reasons I'm retired out of this space and don't want to go back into it. I can't work in a place like that, right? And part of it is my own psyche, my own mentality. But if you can't work in an organization where you're supporting people, trying to bring them up, raise them, and even after your job is done, right? It's not so much you got to be friends with people, but I've got folks who say, you're the best boss I ever had, and you're a great mentor today. Well, I'm grateful for that, right? I mean, I hope that
Right.
my influence endures after you've worked for me and that what I've done is given you an opportunity. So it's what do they call it? Servant leadership. And I think that's been horribly overused, but it's not just about making a pile of
I
money.
just say I have been of service to other people for many, many years, you know. And one of the things I would say, I have some very clear opinions about what the Supreme Court has done recently and some of the things that have come down in the last few months. And that's the reason I have Richard doing a lot of that. But we can talk about it. Because there are a lot of things that are going on around redistricting and all that that I do think is not helpful to the voting process in America.
Mm,
So we're gonna have a chance to talk about all that. I think, and I also think that I really believe in the Constitution of the United States, and I'm having a great time reading this new book. I mean, she makes it a story, almost like a story process. So it
yeah.
is so fun. So I don't know, we'll talk for a few minutes after we finish this podcast, but I think what I can end the podcast with today, at least, and then you certainly can give your final statement. We're going to talk about things where you and I have different points of view, but we have the capacity to sit and listen to those different points of view. And then maybe with, or even without question, we can then come up with some ideas that can be helpful to us. And we don't have to live in the drama of the everyday. We can live in the reality, as you said before, of what is possible between two people. So if it happens between two people, then it can happen between many. So that's the reason that I think we're doing this. And, you know, that's what I think we're doing. So I think that we've done that today. We're trying to show that today.
I think our task here, and some would look at this and say it's really drawn out. Well, what are you all doing? On the one hand, this is to say there's some field rules and there's logic behind the field rules. Okay, you can almost say, well, we're arguing a legal brief here. Well, why is this opinion? Why is that opinion? Why do you say that's a set of facts? Well, we believe, you believe, I believe, etc. We believe collectively that this is a thing, this is a process, right? So we're trying to say
Right.
that if you get out of the flaming headlines and if you step back a little bit, you can have a conversation. And I believe we're trying to put I don't know, almost a set of guidelines together to say stop, think, listen, etc. And then when you get to the thornier issues, people could say, well, they're either living their advice or they're a bunch of useful pundits or they're just the same pop psychology that I can buy in a dime store. We're not the latter, okay? And nor do I think that we're any sort of pundits. But this is more illustrative of how you talk about this thing. And I'll get back to the original comments that were made. We have a division in this country. We need to do something to stop that because it will tear it apart somehow. I don't know what it looks like should it happen, but the cost of it, society wise, financial wise, etc., is unimaginable. So
Right.
how do we stop that? This is not about changing anybody's voting opinions. That's not what our mission is. But it is to say, well, I'm going to be an informed person. And you got to do that in business. You got to do that in life. If you're successful as a human being, you're informed. You can have conversations with people. They value the time that they spend and they invest with you. So how do we do that? How do we show people that it's worthwhile? Um, being better. And maybe that's not the best term. Maybe we can find, but there's a divide, and I don't know how to fix it. But if we just ignore it, it's not going to go away on its own.
Right. Well, and I think one of the things that I think is really important about what you're talking about is I think we need to start facing the things that are not helpful and that are creating all the drama now and deciding how we're going to stand firm with those individuals that represent us to be able to say, we want to have conversations, we want to support the Constitution, we want to support our democracy. And this is 250 years that it's lived. And so therefore we do not have people. We don't need to have people driving the opposite value of destroying what the Constitution represents, what the Bill of Rights represents, what all this has represented and
Yeah.
we've lived well in. So I'm going to end it here and say, to you listeners, maybe you're questioning what we're doing, but we are doing everything we can to show you that we can bring up topics. We're talking about the things that we do not support when we interact with each other. And we are going to do our best to talk about some of the thorny topics and not name political names or do all this other stuff. We're going to talk about the topic and see what we can do with it. So I want to thank you, and I'm going to end the recording now and say I really appreciate you as a friend and colleague. Thank you
Well,
so
all the
much.
listeners out there, get on the train. There's some interesting things going to happen. So thanks, Jacqueline. Always a
Thank,
pleasure.
thank you.